So a few weeks ago, I passed my private pilot check ride. I thought it would be good to take a little time to go over what my check ride experience was like. My experience is not necessarily going to be what your experience is, but maybe there'll be something someone who's headed into a check ride soon could take from this. So I thought I'd go over how I prepped for my check ride, what my experience was during it, and what my plans are next. So first we'll talk about my training. I am not learning at a flight school. I have a CFI who is a professional corporate pilot with 20,000+ hours who teaches as a CFI on the side. He teaches a couple of students at a time because he just enjoys teaching. And he and I have been friends since we were kids. So he just teaches because he enjoys it. The airport I'm learning at is right smack dab in the middle of New York State. It used to be a Air Force base where giant B-52 bombers used to take off from. So it's this giant 12,000 foot runway, which is very forgiving. The airspace is class Delta. It's very quiet. And I think there's a lot of pluses to learning in this space, but I do need to get more experience in busier and more complicated airspace. In terms of hours to get to my check ride, I soloed at 16 hours. I was around 50 or 52 hours when I did my check ride. All told, I had about 30 hours of dual instruction and 22 hours of solo time to get to my check ride. When my CFI and I felt I was ready to do my check ride, we got together and did all the IACRA paperwork. I was able to reach out to a DPE who lives about an hour and a half away from us. We were able to schedule in less than a week. I called him and I had my appointment for the following Saturday. I know in many parts of the country that's not possible. When we talked on the phone, we discussed the cost. He charged me $700 for the exam, plus his travel because he had to fly up to where we were. He gave me my cross-country assignment, and we discussed what I would be allowed to do. And he did tell me I could use ForeFlight for everything on my check ride. He did say he would turn ownership off on ForeFlight, which means it would not show my location on the moving map on ForeFlight. And he said, although I could do my check ride planning inside of ForeFlight, I had to be ready to demonstrate where those numbers came from. And I'll talk about how I prepared for that. Once my check ride was booked, my CFI and I got back together again. We made sure all of the aircraft logs were in order and that the plane was airworthy. We went over my logbook, make sure to double check that I had all the parts. We had already done that when we did the IACRA paperwork. Just in general, we got together to make sure everything was in order and talk about the exam. I did make one of the binders that you'll see a lot of people on YouTube make. I made the binder with the intention of impressing my DPE to show him how organized I was. But honestly, he really didn't pay it much mind. A friend of mine who's a pilot, when we were chatting about binders with other pilots, and I had said that I made it for my DPE, he said, well, I made mine for myself. And he's really right. In truth, I realized I did make it for me. All of the paperwork I needed was there and organized. And when the DPE asked me for it, I was able to put my hands on it quickly and get it for him. I think making a binder is a good idea. I'm not going to go into how I made mine. Go on YouTube. There's a whole bunch of videos on how to make binders. I had decided weeks before that once my check ride was scheduled, I would take the week before my check ride off from work. I wanted that week to really focus on studying for the oral and flying to polish up any rough spots that I had left. In terms of the book studying, I'll put up on the screen here the books I use to do my studying. I found these all very helpful, especially this one, the Private Pilot ACS and Oral Exam Guide by, I guess that's pronounced Gleam or Glime. I found that to be very helpful. It has the ACS in it and a whole bunch of questions. I use Sporties for my ground school, and in the application that you're able to use for that, there were flashcards to help prepare you for the oral exam. I found those really helpful as well. So I just spent a lot of time going through all of that, making notes of the things that I was weak in and drilling back down into those. But honestly, I think the part that was most useful to me in preparing for the oral was watching mock oral exams on YouTube. I didn't know at the time that those were going to be as useful as they were, but I realized in the oral exam that what those mock check rides were on YouTube were very similar to what my oral exam was like. The things I was weak on and spent the time focusing on, and I'm glad I did in terms of the oral, were the human factors. What is hypoxia and the different types of hypoxia, and all of those various human factors. Special use airspace, I needed to really drill down and understand that. I tried really hard to memorize A tomato flames, and I just couldn't remember all of those things. So I just remembered 91.205 in the FAR aim, and that was helpful, but kind of backfired a little bit during the oral, and I'll explain that a bit. The other thing I had trouble with was the clearance requirements in airspace. I'm 58 years old. It is harder getting information into this brain than it was when I was 38. I can still get it in there. It just takes a lot more work. And I just was having a lot of trouble with remembering all the numbers. And I'll put a link down below, but I found a video from Just Plain Silly of something he calls the 313 method. When you first watch this video of how it works, you think it's ridiculous and you're never gonna, it's more complicated than just memorizing a table of numbers, but for me, it wasn't, because it helped me draw a picture of the airspace requirements in my head, and it's a picture that I could quickly recreate based on his method. So check that out if you're having trouble with airspace clearance requirements, and it might help you. So I had planned to do my book work during the day and then go out in the evenings and do flying. But Murphy being who Murphy was, the plane was down for maintenance that entire week. I did not get to fly for real at any point about a week and a half before my check ride. I was a little nervous about that, but it turned out to be okay. I realized one of the last times I flew with my CFI that I was weak on memorizing my emergency procedure checklists, the things that they want you to have committed to memory, and I was weak on those. So not flying for real allowed me an opportunity to take the time and really do some chair flying. Just sit in my chair, close my eyes, and visualize the cockpit and say, okay, we have an engine fire. What are the processes? It's turn off, pull off, shut off, and move my hands to where the controls were, and do that with all the emergency procedures over and over again, till not only was it in my memory, but the motions of where I wanted to go to all those controls. That's not something I would have done if I was flying for real as quickly and as often as I was doing it. I'm also a big Microsoft Flight Simulator fan. That's what got me into wanting to fly in the first place. So I spent some time flying my cross country in Microsoft Flight Simulator and practicing those emergency checklists in the simulator as well. As a side note, I found early on in my training that Microsoft Flight Simulator, for at least Private Pilot, was actually a hindrance to me. It was giving me bad habits. So for a long time during my training, I stopped using Flight Simulator altogether. I was spending too much time on the instruments in the real plane instead of looking outside. It took me a little while to break that habit. So the DPE in my phone call to him had said I could use ForeFlight, but he made clear that I better know where all those numbers came from. So I did plot out my cross country on a paper sectional. I filled out by hand a paper nav log. I also did it in ForeFlight, and those numbers were very close. The night before my check ride, I did update my paper copy just to make sure everything was up to date. I also did my weights and balances by hand because he wanted to make sure that I knew where that came from. I also did my takeoff and landing distances, and I still use a knee board. Even though I have an iPad, I don't like taking notes on it. So I have a knee board that I had, and I did all my takeoff and landing distances and calculations on those. So the day of the check ride comes, and we're scheduled to meet at 9 a.m. at the FBO at my airport. I got there as he flew in, and then we just spent about an hour doing paperwork, just making sure that First, that all of my paperwork was up to date, that the aircraft paperwork was up to date before the check ride even started, before the oral exam even started. And then once the oral exam went, it was just a conversation. It was a pointed conversation. He asked me very pointed questions about the things he wanted me to know. I felt very comfortable for the most part answering his questions. There were a couple times I felt a little shaky on my answers, and I wanted to reference the FAR aim, but I did well on that. There was one part that I got a little shaken up. He was asking me for the clearance requirements in airspace, which by this time I knew cold, but I misunderstood him and thought he was asking me for what the definitions of VFR, marginal VFR, IFR, and low IFR are at the airports. And I drew a complete blank, and I went reaching for the FAR aim, and he said, if you need the FAR aim to tell me if we can fly at this airport today, we have problems. That's when I realized when he was asking for clearance stuff, and I was able to answer after that. Other than that, the questions were very typical of what you will see on many of the mock check rides on YouTube. The oral lasted, with all the paperwork, lasted 3.5 hours. So we finished up a little after noon, and I stepped outside to look up at the clouds, and the clouds were at about 3,500 feet above where we are. We're at 500, and they were scattered. So of course that wasn't a ceiling, but I never had flown where I had to dodge clouds. We just never did that. And we were going to be flying at 4,500 for my cross country. I just did not want to dodge clouds on my check ride when it wasn't something I had done. I made the decision to discontinue at that point. Other than that, the weather was great, but I just didn't feel comfortable doing my check ride around all those clouds, because it was if it was scattered, it was a heavy scattered cloud cover. When I made the decision, I asked him, I said, so tell me, did I make the right decision? He said, you're the pilot in command. You make the decision, so it's the right decision for you. And I felt better. On his flight home that day, he texted me a picture of the cloud cover where he was flying to, which was where my cross country would have been heading towards. And the clouds had gotten a lot thicker and lower. So I definitely made the right decision. Luckily, we were able to schedule to come back the very next day in the afternoon, which, by the way, if you can avoid scheduling your check ride in the afternoon, avoid scheduling your check ride in the afternoon, because you have all day long just sit there and wait for it to show up. And that was a little bit stressful for me. I got the FBO the next day in the afternoon at about 3 o'clock. And then just as I got there, I got a phone call from him that his plane was having a maintenance issue. And he was able to get a plane from the flying club where he flew out of, and he was going to be about an hour late. So that was fine. He got there. We went out to the plane. We did I was doing all the pre-flight, and all during the pre-flight, he's asking me questions about the plane. You know, what does this thing sticking out of the plane do? Or what are these things on the front of the wings for? And I know he's trying to see of my knowledge of the plane itself, but he's also trying to distract me, which is part of what a DPE tries to do at some point, to make sure you can handle that. And he did it in the air as well. At least that was my impression. But everything went fine. We got in the plane, we took off, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the actual flight itself. Obviously I got my certificate. It went well. We started with the cross country, started to head out. We picked out, I found my first waypoint. We started moving to the next one. He asked me why I wasn't using the Garmin devices in the plane, why I wasn't using GPS to help me get to our waypoints. And I said, well, I thought I'm supposed to demonstrate pilotage and dead reckoning. He said, well, yeah, but you can use anything in the aircraft, which surprised me. And what that taught me was I needed to have a bigger discussion with him beforehand about what I was and was not allowed to do. But that was fine. I knew the course where we were going. I could fly it through pilotage and dead reckoning. As soon as we diverted, he started emergency procedures. My first emergency procedure didn't go great. I just made a couple of mistakes, and he kind of got he kind of jumped on me at those mistakes, which shook me up. I admit that I got a little rattled by his reaction, but that's okay. I recovered. It took me a few minutes to recover, but at that point, I thought I had done bad enough that I failed the check ride. I'd completely forgotten that when you fail a check ride, the DPE tells you that you're not up to the standards, and he gives you the option to discontinue. He didn't say that, so I had not, failed the standards, but in my head I had, and that kind of helped me relax. So the rest of the flight, I was really relaxed, kind of disappointed, but also very relaxed. So I finished everything, did really well, did some of the best maneuvers I've done since I started flying. We landed back at the airport, and I had to drive him back to the FBO because the hangar is about a mile from the FBO on that giant 2-mile long runway. We got out of the car, and I was getting ready to shake his hand and say, when can, what's next? He said, well, come on in the FBO. I'll give you your temporary certificate. And I said, I'm sorry, what? I passed? He said, well, yeah, you passed. And so I was surprised. I was genuinely surprised that I had passed the exam because of that one error I had made, which further on, he hit me on that item again, and I did fine. But I asked him about the mistake I had made. He goes, he said, you have to work on this particular thing. You've got to get with your CFI and work on it some more. But you're a safe pilot. You're going to be fine, and you now have your license to learn, which, as I've heard from my CFI, my DPE, many of my online and real pilot friends, a private pilot license is a license to learn. So what am I going to do with that license to learn? Well, one of the things I've been doing is making a list of things they don't teach you when you're doing your private pilot license. And as I go around and do things, I'm learning, wow, I have no idea how to interact with an FBO that's not my FBO. I really need to spend some time getting more comfortable in Class Charlie airspace, and maybe someday into Class Bravo airspace. I've got to start venturing away from this kind of 75-mile radius around my home airport that I've become pretty comfortable with, and start going other places and experiencing different challenges. I am looking to join a club that is near to me. The airport I fly out of now is an hour away. The situation I have there is a great deal, but that hour tends to be, especially as the nights are going to be getting longer, that hour is going to be getting more and more in the way. There's a Class Charlie airport 10 minutes from me that has a club that I'm going to probably be joining. They have 3 aircraft that I would be able to fly there. Down the road, who knows? I know I want to do my instrument rating, and I was getting ready to just jump right into the book learning part of my instrument, and my CFI advised me, he says, Chris, just relax and fly and enjoy flying the plane around for a while. Get another 30, 40 hours under your belt, and then we'll come back and start working on instrument. And I think for me, and again, it's different for everybody, but for me, that's good advice. I do need to just go out and use that license to learn to do things better and experience different things and get very proficient in them. Further down the road, who knows? I've thought about maybe trying to get my commercial and then getting my CFI certificate. So as a retirement gig, which for me is not that long away, but maybe for a retirement gig, do some teaching. The last thing I will say is I went into my check ride with the understanding that the gentleman who performed my check ride was there to ensure that I was going to be safe, because I wanted to start taking my family up flying with me. He was there kind of as that last roadblock before my own decision making to make sure that I was safe enough to do that. I've gotten a lot of confidence out of the check ride, and I've flown a few times since. 3 hours after I completed my check ride, the weather turned crappy in upstate New York for almost a week straight, so I didn't get to fly again for a week. But I have been back up in the air. I've taken my wife up. I've taken my father up, and we have plans to go up later this weekend as well. So it's been really good. I hope this was useful. Maybe not, but I hope it was useful. I hope you found something from just me sitting here as a talking head. If you're headed for your check ride, good luck with it. Study up, practice up. If your CFI tells you you're ready, you're ready, even if you think you're not. you're going to be ready. And if you're not, if you get up there and you have problems, you get to go back and try again. So thanks for watching. I hope it was helpful. See ya.